Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Harriet Hamassi, Dean of the Library at Georgetown, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this year's Casey-McIlvane Memorial Lecture. Today's program features Georgetown colleagues José Casanova, Professor Emeritus and Senior Fellow at the Berkeley Center, and also Tom Banchoff, Professor and Vice President for Global Engagement. The Casey-McIlvane Lecture Fund was established in 1997 in memory of Francis Casey Jr., class of 1950, and in honor of Reverend Donald McIlvane, class of 1946. We express our sincere gratitude to all of those who have made this annual lecture possible. As we turn to today's session, we are delighted to welcome our distinguished guests, and we thank you, José and Tom, for sharing your great knowledge and expertise with us and for inviting us into your conversation about Jesuits as global diplomats. Thank you. Tom, would you begin?
Thank you very much, Harriet, for your kind introduction and for your leadership of our library system here at Georgetown through the pandemic and beyond. I'm really delighted to be here for the Casey-McIlvane Lecture with my colleague and friend, José Casanova, with you and all the participants online. I say participants and not audience because the goal here is to really have a conversation, a dialogue about some critical issues and to bring you in as much as we can and as soon as we can, if indeed we can discipline ourselves in our two-way conversation to get things started. So with that in mind, please have a look at the Q&A function and start sending in questions as soon as we begin. And as I say, we'll try to leave plenty of time for a wider conversation going forward. Now, before I introduce José, let me say a little bit about our topic in general. As Harriet mentioned, the title of the conversation today is Practicing the Culture of Encounter, Jesuits as Global Diplomats from the Early Modern Era to the Present. I think you'll agree it's a very fitting topic for Georgetown for several reasons. We are the oldest Catholic and Jesuit university in the United States, located in Washington, D.C., which is still the capital of the most influential country in the world. We have a vibrant Jesuit community with scholars and teachers across disciplines here on campus. And of course, we're home to the Walsh School of Foreign Service, founded in 1919. Many of you will remember it was pre-COVID, not too long ago. In 2019, we celebrated the centennial of the Walsh School. And of course, we'll be learning more, hearing more about Edmund Walsh, S.J. as part of our conversation. So there's really no one better equipped to accompany us through these topics than my friend and colleague, José Casanova. Many of you know him already as one of the world's most preeminent sociologists of religion. He's the author of Public Religions in the Modern World, a classic, widely considered a canonical text for the study of religion and world affairs, published now some 25 years ago. We were very fortunate to recruit José from the New School for Social Research 13, 14 years ago now into our Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, where he has been a pillar of our activities. He continues to be very active as a senior fellow, but has, as you've heard, taken on a more elevated status as a professor emeritus of both sociology and theology. So José, if it's okay with you, I'm going to refrain from mentioning your awards and accolades and honorary degrees so that we have a little more time for discussion. So with that, why don't we jump right in? And rather than going straight into the topic matter, we agreed it made sense to hear a little bit about your intellectual development, how you got interested in the topic of the Jesuits, and along the way you can share some of your own scholarly trajectory.
Well, first of all, thank you, Tom, for the kind introduction, as always. And thank you, Dean Hemasi, for the kind invitation to deliver the lecture this year. It's a great honor for me. Well, actually, I met the Jesuits in the sense in Innsbruck when I studied theology. They were running the Faculty of Theology of the School of the State University. And I also was resident fellow, I mean, a student at the Collegium Canisianum for 4 years. This was right after the council. It was, for me, it was obvious that the Jesuits had played a crucial role in the aggiornamento. Those were the most important intellectually and probably personally formative years for me. And however, then I became a sociologist. And actually it was my professor, the person who had the greatest influence on my intellectual development, Franz Schupp, the young, brilliant theologian, the successor of Karl Rahner in the chair of dogmatics in Innsbruck, that actually told me to come to the new school in New York City to study German sociology. And while studying German sociology, I became basically a student of modernity. And the Jesuits do not have a very good reputation in any history of modernity. They appear as the counter-Reformation, the counter-Enlightenment, the counter-liberalism, the counter-nationalism. So it was for me actually a late discovery as I became less and less satisfied with the Eurocentrism and the modernicentrism of our theories of the globe, that looking for a kind of a revisionist theory of globalization and going beyond our theories of Western modernity, that I really became acquainted historically with the Jesuits and the work they did in the early modern era as pioneer globalizers.
Thanks, Jose. And perhaps we should throw in a plug for our book. Since you mentioned some of the intellectual genesis, we co-edited a volume with Georgetown University Press 4 or 5 years ago now on the Jesuits and globalization, which was a wonderful experience and my opportunity to get to know you better and become more familiar with this important work. So you shared a little bit about your intellectual trajectory. Now, if we go back to the Jesuits historically, founded in 1540 by Ignatius of Loyola with friends that he had met at the University of Paris, very quickly established as a dynamic order of missionaries, but also educators within the church. That's what we think of when we think of Jesuits: missionaries, educators, scholars, not so much diplomats. Can you tell us something about that side of the story?
Well, diplomats, some of them actually, very few of them, actually function as official diplomats in different contexts. And we can talk about a few of them, the most famous one later on. But besides this role as official diplomats, one can think their global role as cultural brokers between North and South, East and West, and all the cultures of the world. And in this respect, is practicing what Pope Francis, the Jesuit Pope, has called the practice of the culture of the encounter. And it is in this role particularly that you could say has been a characteristic of almost all the Jesuits in their global missions. So some of them have played a role as official diplomats, and we can talk about a few of them. And then, however, most of them have played this unique role as intercultural brokers, as practicing the culture of the encounter between Christianity and other religions, between cultures, between civilizations. And so in this particular role, I think is very, very important to define their unique global contribution.
Well, why don't we go through a few concrete examples that come top of mind to you to illustrate this fascinating.
Well, let's say two of the most famous one, Antonio Posevino, who was the mediator of the Jan Zapolsky Treaty that brought to an end the Livonian War, the war between the Tsardom of Russia and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that had been going on for 30 years. And then the Treaty of Nerchinsk between Russia and China, which was mediated by Thomas Pereira, particularly, but also by Jean-François Gervillon, a French Jesuit in Beijing. I mean, both are 100 years apart. Both treaties are 100 years apart. What is important is the fact that they were sent. I mean, even Francis Xavier, the pioneer and the prototype of the global missionary, when he left Lisbon in 1541, he went as official ambassador of King John III of Portugal, but also as a papal legate, as a nuncio, as a papal nuncio. And when he entered Japan, this was the titles he actually used to enter beyond where the Portuguese traders had entered in Japan. But those two, I mean, Posevino himself was a typical first generation Jesuits. He joined the order in 59, also a few years after the death of Ignatius. He was already an accomplished, renowned Renaissance scholar. He became immediately linked with Lainez, working with him in, yes, indeed, the polemicist counter-reformation against the Valdenses in Italy, against the Huguenots in France. And later he accompanied Borgia in his trip to France. But then Pope Gregory XIII, he served as Latin secretary for the fourth Father General, Mercurian. And then Pope Gregory XIII sent him to the king of, to the court of King John III of Sweden, precisely to mediate in what was then the Swedish-Polish War. And then eventually he spent about 12 years as a diplomat, going from Sweden to Poland, to Lithuania, to Russia, but also to other parts in Eastern Europe. In the process, he established Jesuit colleges everywhere, in Chambéry, in Turin, in Vilnius in Lithuania, in Braunio in Poland, in Olomouc in Moravia, in Cluj in Romania. So in this respect, he was a typical Jesuit. He was trusted precisely by the Pope and by the kings and by all the courts, if you wish, and he could play precisely this role because of that. So this will be, he became too political, and Acquaviva eventually sent him to exile from Rome, banned him from Rome, and eventually he was sent to the Venetian territory. He ended his life as a great scholar, writing the famous Bibliotheca Selecta. That became kind of the encyclopedia of Counter-Reformation learning for the Jesuits, the Ratio Studiorum, and also a famous director of spiritual exercises. Among the persons he influenced as director of spiritual exercise was Francis de Sales, the bishop and later also saint. So this will be one typical that did play a role in the Eastern European conflicts of the time. This was part of the attempt to bring Russia into the West to form an alliance with the Christian powers against the Muslim powers. So never happened, but certainly he played a crucial role. He was the first Westerners to visit the court of Ivan III, Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible in Muscovy. A second one, let's say, or maybe you have a question or a comment.
No, I think we'll want to come back to some other examples. The example from Central Europe, Eastern Europe is fascinating. There are others, of course, that we'll touch on the Far East, but also in the Americas. But maybe a preliminary question is, how did members of the order within a generation get into position where they were so trusted, not just by popes, but by foreign governments? Is there something about the charism, the identity of the Jesuits that enabled that dramatic transformation? Yeah.
Well, they very soon emerged as, and this is why John III immediately asked Ignatius to send him a Jesuit to be sent to the Indies. They very soon emerged as famous scholars. I mean, the first companions, all of them had degrees from the University of Paris, the most important university of the time. So they're important as educators, as learned men, as Renaissance humanist scholars, but also their missionary zeal, dedication to the common good, and the fact that they have created this unique identity for themselves in between. They were not fully a religious order in the old style, but they were also diocesan priests that were basically, if you wish, sedentary, but they were mobile. and they were ready to assume any mission where they could basically advance the glory of God and the common good, which what precisely appears in the constitutions. So it is this dual role of as missionaries, but also as persons dedicated to the common good, wherever the common good needed to be furthered and to be represented.
And that precisely, the dedication to the common good, openness to public affairs, to working with elites, that was something radically new, wasn't it, within the Catholic Church, within an order as such a.
I mean, people, obviously, the kings had always had royal confessors, and the mendicant orders had often served as royal confessors. What made the Jesuits both unique but also then controversial is the fact that so soon they became trusted royal confessors in all the courts of Europe at the same time, simultaneously, when the kings were basically at war with one another often. So this notion of having Coton in his ear, I mean, Louis XIII had the father Coton as his royal confessor, as trusted advisor. So this idea of having Coton in the ear's king, a Jesuit in the ear's king, would become a symbol. And if we think of the fact that they became such as trusted royal advisors to emperors in Asia, to kings everywhere, and then eventually to indigenous native people also. So for the common good, they were ready to serve. At the time, civil servants meant servants of rulers, but also servants of indigenous native populations in the missions, sometimes against the kings. So it is this ability to serve, to dedicate themselves really to service. So foreign service became a characteristic of them from the beginning. They were open to go anywhere in the world to serve the people anywhere, was to help souls. This is what appears in every almost page of the Jesuits, as Father O'Malley, the great historian, has indicated, but also precisely to serve. Let me ask as an indication to say something which appears in the diary of Thomas Pereira, which is the next Jesuit I would like to comment on. Nothing but the welfare of souls and the equally important common good can oblige us to take up affairs of this kind, affairs of state. And then only on occasions when we must submit to the wishes of the princes, whom for the love of God we serve disinterestedly. It is this notion of serving disinterestedly that is what they thought, but people didn't see it this way. They thought that they served for the interest of the Society of Jesus and sometimes for a global project of global power. And this, of course, what led them to controversies. But let me briefly, Thomas Pereira. Again, he was sent to Beijing as a great musician and mathematician. He joined the court of Beijing very early, when the Kangxi Emperor was only 16, and he himself was 27, well, actually 18. Kangxi Emperor was 18, he was 27, and he basically became his trusted advisor for the next 30 years. And it is on this basis that the Kangxi Emperor sent him to mediate the treaty with Russia, when the conflicts between the expanding Russian Empire into the east and the Chinese Empire, they began to have all kinds of conflicts. And it was Pereira who basically mediated a treaty that established the territorial boundaries between the two expanding empires, boundaries that lasted for 2 years until the middle of the 19th century. Now, what is interesting is the treaty was written in Latin, and only then translated into Russian, into Manchu, that was the language of the emperor and of the court, and then into Chinese. Of course, the Chinese translation is very different from the Russian one. So it is also their ability somehow to precisely mediate what appeared to be almost irresolvable conflicts that gave him this unique ability.
this was 1689. Is that right? I just
1689, right. And again, 3 years later, the Kangxi Emperor then proclaimed the Edict of Toleration of Christianity, precisely as a kind of recognition of the great services that the court Jesuits, Verbiest and Pereira, had precisely done for the court and for him personally.
Mm-hmm. So as you've already hinted, a lot of these political involvements came at a cost, generated enemies inside and outside the church. Can you talk about the experience accompanying the colonial enterprise, especially in Latin America, as participants, but also as critics, and how that changed the political dynamic within the region, but also within the society and within the church?
The expansion of the Jesuit missions first was into the east and into Brazil, thanks to the Padroado, the Portuguese Padroado. It was the Portuguese that were the first truly protectors of the Jesuits, and the Jesuits were able to expand their missions through the Portuguese Padroado all the way from Brazil to Africa through Asia. The expansion into Latin America came later because although it was, many people view the Jesuits as a Spanish order, and the first 3 Father Generals were Spanish, and the Portuguese make sure that the fourth would not be Spanish, it would not be Polanco, but it would be somebody else. But nonetheless, Spain, Philip II, took a long, long time to accept them, to trust them, and to allow them to go to Latin America. So the Jesuits actually arrived in Latin America roughly in the late 60s, 1560s, basically 40 years after the spiritual conquest of much of the empire has done by the other mendicant orders, Dominicans, Franciscans, Benedictines, Augustinians, etc. So the Jesuits that found their own niche in the empire, and their niche was the urban colleges, and then the parishes for natives, the native parishes, and then especially the missions at the borders of the empire, the borders between the Spanish and the Portuguese Empire. This was the Paraguay missions, all through the Amazonian, basically, border. They had the Jesuits had missions all throughout the Amazonian and all the borders, what we will consider today Brazil, Argentinian, Bolivian, Peruvian, Colombian borders, etc. And then precisely at the very borders of the empires with tribes that were not fully conquered, let's say in the north, in the Chihuahua region and in the Arizona region, Baja California. It was in those places where the Jesuits developed their missions with the indigenous people.
And can you say something about efforts of certain Jesuits to critique the colonial practices of the destruction of indigenous peoples and cultures? How did that play out as a political issue within the society and in the broader context? Yeah.
I mean, they were again not the first ones. Obviously, it had been the Dominicans that had been really with first Father Sinos and then Cristóbal de las Casas. That really, Father de las Casas, that were the first really critique of the Spanish oppression of the indigenous people, especially through the encomienda. And in this respect, their critiques only simply added to what had already been done by other religious orders. So in this respect, they were not unique. What was unique is that precisely because they had these native missions with indigenous people at the border of the empire, there they could protect the indigenous people from the empire, and they were able to gain the support of the court against the Spanish conquistadores or against the Portuguese that actually wanted to basically enslave the Indian population, the indigenous population, the Sao Paulo that went to raids, enslaving the Indians, and then led the Jesuits to take all the native people and move the missions down the rivers into what will become then the Paraguay missions. So, and this we see how when the real conflict developed, the fact that the Jesuits had actually helped to mobilize the Indians into militias to protect the Spanish Empire from the Portuguese raiders. But later, obviously, when the Portuguese and the Spanish empires redraw the borders, the Jesuit missions were caught in between and they had to move. And then the indigenous people mobilized to help each other and fought against both, against the Spanish armies, colonial armies, and the Portuguese colonial armies. In the process, of course, leading to the final, basically both the Spanish and the Portuguese kings being very upset at the Jesuits, leading eventually to the suppression of the Jesuits, both in the Portuguese, first in the Portuguese colonies, and eventually all throughout the Spanish Empire.
And that was 1773, the official suppression of the order. It's a remarkable story, right? To hear the.
I mean, the 73 is the suppression by the Pope. So eventually, even the Pope
Exactly
basically added to. So first, every Catholic king suppressed the order, and then the Catholic royals, all of them together, gang up and made sure that the next, who was going to be the next Pope, would suppress the order.
Yeah. It's a remarkable story of deep political engagement. I mean, and it's a story that people are not as aware of as they might be. And it's a great contrast to the subsequent history of the Jesuit order after the Restoration in 1814. In the interest of time, let's fast forward to our own Edmund J. Walsh, one of the founders of our School of Foreign Service, and see if there are lines of continuity or change, in your opinion, in his interactions and activities as a diplomat as well as a scholar. So just a couple of facts for folks as background. Father Walsh was born. Yep.
First, let me say that his international interest came because of the fact that he was actually studying theology in Innsbruck, in the same place where I studied theology, right before World War I. So he came in 1913.
Yep.
In 1914, when the war started, he had to leave to Innsbruck to continue studying theology in Woodstock. Was ordained a priest in 1916. Dean of the college, of Georgetown College, but then came again the US entering World War I, and once again, international affairs interfering. He became involved in the formation of the ROTC system, basically organizing the system throughout the Eastern colleges. And then in 1919 came the formation, the foundation of the School of Foreign Service, several years before the US itself had a foreign service. So in this effort, they were ahead of even the US in the notion of the need for a foreign service, training diplomats that would know international languages and cultures to serve precisely international peace. Mm-hmm. And then he was called by the Vatican in 1922 to serve as the director of the Papal Vatican Relief Mission of the famine, the relief of the famine in Russia under the Bolshevik regime. Of course, he came to know the Bolshevik regime firsthand, personally, under the conditions of the famine, and basically prepared him well to understand the Bolsheviks in a way that a lot of people did not understand first. So he became clear in anti-communist, and later when the Cold War, he would appear as such a person. But he was really a diplomat, not only in this case, helping the Bolshevik regime, if you wish. Later, he became the US bishops, sent him to organize the relief for the Middle East, the Welfare Association that became the model for Caritas everywhere. Later, he was sent again by the Pope to mediate the conflict during the Cristero Wars in Mexico between the government and the Catholic Church. Later, again, he was sent by the Jesuits but also by the Pope to the possibility of establishing a college in Baghdad that will become the first Jesuit college, a high school in Baghdad. Eventually, he joined the Nuremberg trial as an advisor to the US commission at the Nuremberg trial to study the suppression and the oppression of the Catholics during the Nazi regime. And then eventually, after the war, he went to Japan as a visitor general right after Nagasaki and Hiroshima during the precisely US occupation as a visitor general of the Jesuits, as a visitor of the Jesuits. And so there he actually met Arrupe, who had been in Hiroshima. And so it is a fantastic long life of missions. And then all of them basically both domestic and foreign service, and both service of the church, service of the Society of Jesus, service of the bishops, and service, of course, of the US as well.
It is a remarkable story. So my first question is, when you were looking at the early modern period, you had a bunch of different examples of Jesuits engaged in public affairs and diplomacy. When we moved to the 20th century, was Walsh really the exception, or was he part of a broader pattern? Yeah.
Well, exception in the sense that he became a professional diplomat. What is new is the fact that now the distinction between foreign and domestic service is very clear. Mm-hmm. For the early Jesuits, they as were ready to go anywhere in the world. They themselves were not citizens of any country. When they left their countries to their missions, they went as basically envoys or sent by the Father General, not by their own countries. They didn't go as nationals of their countries. They went as Jesuits sent by the Father General for universal mission because of the obedience to the Pope. The fourth vow gave them universal access to missions everywhere. And so it is this unique combination that was part of the early modern. Later, the Westphalian system becomes much more established of separate nation state, each of them with, if you wish, their own national interests. And now their situation is much more ambiguous. It's also in this time in the 20th century that most Jesuits become much more settled as nationals in their countries, although they begin once again foreign missions. So there are both, I mean, in the United States, while they were being expelled from almost every Catholic country throughout the 19th century, and again expelled from Latin America again and again, they are welcome in the United States, and they can establish Jesuit colleges everywhere. And from here, they can reestablish global missions from the United States. Many of the Jesuits expelled from Germany, from France, from Belgium, from Italy, from Spain, from the US will begin global missions again in Japan, in India. And they come back to the Amazons and to Chihuahua to be welcomed by the natives indigenous that still remember their ancestors, the Jesuits who had been their servants 200 years ago, and welcome them very gladly again, the Jesuits, as their padres.
Mm-hmm. Good. So let's come back to Walsh and an interesting moment in his career, the beginning of the Cold War. I think it's hard maybe for some younger members of our audience to understand the role that anti-communism played as an ideological force, not just in the US, this was, of course, the McCarthy era, but also in the global church. Could you situate him a little bit in that context and his role and his way of sort of combining the role of priest and politician and diplomat? Yeah.
Well, of course, this was the time of the alliance of the Catholic Church, the Protestant West, the US. Let's not forget that the Protestantism and Catholicism had been at war for several centuries, and the Catholic Church had not been viewed by democratic countries very positively. And however, the Cold War allowed the formation of the European Union, again, the alliance of Washington and Rome, and the alliance of Catholics, German and French Catholics for basically to overcome the national wars. And it's a unique period in this respect that allows precisely this new role. Some people would say he was too much of a Cold Warrior, but for me, precisely because I have come to know personally the situation of the Great Famine, the Holodomor in Ukraine, It took me a long, long time to become as critical as of the Bolsheviks as I would also eventually become. I was a leftist, critical of the Franco regime, and it was not easy for me to assume this role. But then the more you know the Bolshevik regime and what it did to people, the more it's easier to understand the role of those priests and their anti-communism. I mean, just a few weeks ago, I had a conversation with Father Halik from the Czech Republic, an underground priest, certainly not an anti-communist in the ideological sense, but certainly somebody who is open to freedom and democracy in a way that was not possible under the communist regime. Let's not forget that throughout this period, the Father General of the Jesuits was Father Ledochovsky, a Polish aristocrat who was very much pro-fascist, you could say almost, even you could say anti-Semitic orientations that serve as one of the longest Father Generals in the, certainly from World War I to World War II. He served as the Father General.
It's just fascinating, of course, because the Jesuit order took a very different turn after Vatican II in a much more progressive direction. But the main
and
line
also had, and you could say that the refounding of the order by Father Arrupe, it was also a finding of their own roots. I mean, it had been a very, very pro-Semitic order. Here, the story I mentioned Posevino. Posevino himself had been a new Christian, most likely, and certainly he was the great defender of the right of Jews to enter the order and against the changing of the constitutions under Aquaviva, precisely because it changed the rules and the new Christians were not able to join the Jesuit order. It was the last order to do so. Other orders had done so already in Portugal and in Spain. And under the anti-Semitism of the time in Spain and Portugal, eventually the Pope also and the Jesuits also accepted this rule.
Great. Well, keep the questions coming in. We have one that I want to share about Father Walsh that relates to Latin America, maybe links back to some of our previous discussion. The question is, can you say more about Father Walsh's involvement in the Cristeros revolution in Mexico? What was his role? Was this after Miguel Pro was killed, or was he sent there because he was killed? That's a detail you can explain to us. Yeah.
Well, I'm not expert myself in this field. He was not involved in the Cristero War. He was sent in 1928 to basically to mediate the peace between put an end to the Cristero War. So he was sent by the Pope, and by also involved had been the US diplomats, the US ambassador in Mexico had been involved in this mediation also. So he was not precisely, he could play the role because he was trusted by the US ambassador, he was trusted by the Vatican, he was trusted by the Mexican Catholic Church, but he was also trusted by the Mexican government.
Good. So we want to leave a little time to come back to the president and to Pope Francis, but I want to, and of course, if there are further questions about Father Walsh, we can come back to that too. But I wanted to share a letter that Dwight Eisenhower sent to Georgetown when Father Walsh died in 1956, which was coincidentally 4 centuries after Ignatius of Loyola's death. And this is from Eisenhower. So you get a feel for the era that Jose is evoking here. The death of Father Walsh is a grievous loss to the society in which he served so many years. That's not the Society of Jesus for me. I think it's the Society of the United States. To the educational and religious, no, I suppose it is the Society of Jesus. To the educational and religious life of the United States and to the free people of the Western world. For 4 decades, he was a vigorous and inspiring champion of freedom for mankind and independence for nations. At every call of duty, all his energy and leadership and wisdom of counsel were devoted to the service of the United States.
Well, this is unique. This is unique of the Jesuits' role in the United States and of Georgetown.
Yeah.
At the time, Georgetown was founded in the interregnum, precisely when there was no Society of Jesus. But Father Carroll, who was the first bishop of the United States, selected by what was his fellow Jesuit priests, brothers. The Georgetown University, there was no conflict between the service to the Society of Jesus and the service to the United States. At the time when in Europe, precisely nationalism had become anti-clerical, anti-religious very frequently in Latin countries, and very frequently the Jesuits were expelled from those countries, so they found themselves that they could not serve the church and their nation simultaneously. So it is this, basically, if you wish, possibility of serving both the US, their order, the Society of Jesus, and the papacy simultaneously. That was much more difficult to do in many Latin, European and Latin American countries.
And there's a link here too, right, to the sort of minority identity of Catholics in the United States and their desperate efforts to mainstream and to contribute to.
Let's not forget that the Carrols, two of the Carrols were signatories of the Declaration of Independence. So they were born with a American republicanism, right? Not Republican Party, but republicanism, the Res Publica, the service to the Res Publica, to the common good, to democracy. And in his visit to Japan, Father Walsh talks of the need to inculcate democracy into the Japanese, what of course the occupation is trying to do, right? To re-educate the Japanese people away from the emperor, et cetera, towards democracy. But Father Walsh insists that democracy is not only a political ideology, but it has to be almost a religious ethos. So this notion of fusing the religious ethos with democracy is also very, very Georgetown. At a time when many of the Jesuits that were expelled from Europe were anti-democrat, precisely. And so there is this conflict, this kind of problematic relation between American Jesuits, which are so clearly pro-democratic, that the Americanist heresy, and so many of expelled Jesuits from Europe that are anti-Americanist.
Very good. So we have a question about the link between diplomacy and missionary activity, I think going back even further. Was there a link between intercultural and interreligious encounter and diplomatic practice?
Well, in the sense that very soon, the Jesuits, already you could say there is something in the orientation of the Jesuits as a spiritual pastors that goes back to the spiritual exercises and the need to somehow accommodate the pastorate, the exercise to each individual needs. So it is this need to accommodate to the other, to the needs of the other. But this became very clear when Balignano was sent as visitor to Japan to examine the Japanese mission, and he found that the Portuguese were trying too much to Portugalize the Japanese, to basically to bring along with Christianity, Portuguese customs, Portuguese way of being. And it was Balignano that then develops the method of accommodation to Japanese culture, the need to enculturate, the fact that the Jesuits have to become first themselves Japanese before Christianity truly become Japanese, or with Japanese become Christians. And this was the method, of course, that Ricci brought to China, and that later so many other Jesuits, Desideri in Tibet, and other Jesuits in the Madurai mission in India, and to a certain extent, even Acosta in Latin America, in Lima, where he insists that to Christianize the indigenous is not necessary to Hispanize them. This idea that you don't need to Europeanize the other, that Christianity is somehow this universal religion without culture, that Christianity is not a European religion, therefore you don't need to Europeanize the other. You can bring Christianity into the native language, through the native language, through the native culture. So you have to somehow incarnate Christianity in each culture, and only in this way it can truly become universal. And somehow they are aware that from the beginning Christianity is both Latin and Greek, and therefore it can also become Japanese and Chinese and Guarani. I mean, the Guarani's mission. Paraguay is today the only country in Latin America that still most people speak Guarani, not Spanish, because this was the language of everybody. And the language, and because many of them were not even Spanish missionaries, they were German missionaries, Czech missionaries, Bohemian, Italian missionaries. This international character of the missions, in which they didn't bring any particular national European culture, but they brought Christianity along with the enculturation, and with meant to be at the service of the people they wanted to become Christians.
Well, we hear echoes there, I think, of some of the ideas of Pope Francis. And so let's return, or come to rather, Pope Francis and this amazing pontificate at the end of our conversation. The first Jesuit Pope, very active on the global stage. We have a couple of questions that have come in. One is an important general question maybe you could comment on to get us started. Could you comment on the fact that Pope Francis is a Jesuit? Is there a specific impact on his diplomatic work?
I think yes, in the sense of his own personal experience as an immigrant to Argentina. And then his experiences provincial, and his negative role he played, and the need to learn how to be more diplomatic, to keep different parts of Argentinian Catholicism together in dialogue with one another instead of going into civil war. And this you find in these interviews with Espadaro in Civiltà Católica, his learning experience, and the way in which he talks of accommodation, enculturation, and many of other crucial discernment, and many other crucial aspects of being a Jesuit, which is important because after being the bishop, after being made a bishop, he almost broke contact with the Jesuit province in Argentina. So first, when he was made a pope, the Jesuits were a bit apprehensive how much of a Jesuit he is. So it was for them a kind of a great consolation, which was a great Jesuit word, also to see how much of a Jesuit he was. A Jesuit, but also in the sense also of this global service, of being the Bishop of Rome, of being open to precisely ready to practice the culture of the encounter with anybody, with the Moscow Patriarchate in La Habana, with the Sunni leader in Qatar, in Abu Dhabi, with now with al-Sistani, the Shiite leader in Iraq, with anybody. He will go to Lampedusa to practice the culture of the encounter with the immigrants and refugees. He will go to basically India and to practice the culture of the encounter with ordinary people in a shrine where Christians and Buddhists and Hindus come together. Let's say I'm talking of Sri Lanka. And so it is this willingness. He doesn't go so much. He has not visited yet Argentina. He doesn't visit so much places where we can be acclaimed as the great, if you wish, Catholic leader, because many other popes also travel a lot. I mean, John Paul II had traveled all over. But it was more to travel to show his kind of, if you wish, almost charismatic role as the leader of the Catholics. Francis goes there to encounter the other. In many of his visits are to encounter the other. His visit to Korea, his visit to Sri Lanka, his visit to the Middle East, or when he visits the places in Europe, is in the peripheries, to do the work of the immigrants, to accompany the immigrants, the refugees.
Now, someone asked about China here. So China is a good example of diplomatic engagement. He has not been able to visit China. He said he would like to, but he has engaged in dialogue with the Chinese government on a range of questions and been criticized roundly for it. Do you see lines of continuity there with earlier approaches to China and Jesuit?
For the Jesuit, China is especially symbolic. It's the great China mission, China and Japan, of course. Russia also, Russia had the Mission Muscovitica has always been very crucial for the Jesuits since the 17th century. But China, of course, they know the Chinese culture. They know that it cannot be treated simply as a communist regime the way it was treated. It's an old country, a state that has more than 2,000 years old. They knew that they could not impose their way, unlike the papal legate. They thought could come to China and impose the Vatican way upon China. They know they cannot do that. And they had to enter into true dialogue with a very old civilization, a very old power that doesn't fit neatly within the Westphalian model also of international relations, because of the long history of tributary relations that the Chinese empire had with all its neighbors. So knowing this culture, they have to practice the culture of the encounter at many, many different levels. The way they did with the Emperor Kangxi, the fact that they played such a role as servants, almost as courtiers of the Kangxi emperor. And that, however, this was what allowed them to protect the Kangxi, the Jesuits at the court could then protect the Jesuits and the Jesuit missions and the Chinese Christians everywhere. So this willingness to a certain extent to try every possible way to protect Christianity and to advance Christian interests, but not just for the sake of Christians, but for the common good.
Very good. Well, maybe as a last question, I'll touch on an issue that was raised in the chat and put a twist on it. And that is the issue of the future of democracy. If we look around the world now, we think of Pope Francis, the Jesuit, engaging in a culture of encounter at a time when a lot of the political trends are in the wrong direction. We know existing democracies are facing difficulties of various kinds, but also that autocracy is on the rise, human rights violations on the rise around the world. How does that change the context for a culture of encounter? Can you, as Pope, for example, actively criticize the human rights situation in different countries? And how do you balance that kind of diplomacy with the need for dialogue and support for Catholics within those national spaces?
A long-term perspective, historical perspective, leads to a recognition that there are some fundamental principles that have to be defended, but not necessarily forms of government. And so to defend the common good, to defend the interests of all of humanity, to defend the rights of every person, but not necessarily in the terms of juridical defense of human rights, the way we may view it in the West. And this, you can go to the early period in which, on the one hand, the Jesuits served loyally kings everywhere, but they were also accused of being regicides because they did not defend the absolute rights of kings, because they defended the right of a common universal good that was over the Westphalian principles, that they were not loyal to the Westphalian principle of royal absolute sovereignty, but they were ready to defend the right of the people to choose their rulers. Not democracy, but the form of popular sovereignty that goes back to the Middle Ages, to the rights of people, that actually was against the absolute rights of kings. So in this respect, there is these fundamental principles they will defend, but it transcends also historical forms of government, including sometimes our own understanding of what democracy is. Obviously, democracy in ancient Athens was very different from democracy in the medieval let's say, communes, were also a form of popular sovereignty. I mean, the Renaissance humanists, many of the Italian Jesuits came from these basically urban republics. So they were familiar with the concept of republicanism, but it's different from the modern conception of democracy. So again, in this respect, and if the modern conception of democracy means national sovereignty, but at the expense of the universal common good, then Jesuits cannot accept this absolute national interest. There is always the universal interest of the common good of humanity has to be there as a critique of national democracies.
Well, thanks, Jose. We certainly covered a lot of ground in an hour and answered a lot of questions, raised a lot of new ones. On behalf of everyone who's been participating in this event, I want to thank you for spending time with us. I want to invite people to stay in touch with us, to email me or Jose. You can easily find our emails with any follow-on questions. And again, I want to thank Harriet for hosting us, and with that, turn it back over to her.
Thank you so much, Tom and Jose. I just want to say that this is such a perfect example of scholars, profiles of scholars, two scholars who have found ways through their career to assimilate and to synthesize facts into meaning and to understand the impact of those facts and the history. I think it is this melding of scholarly research and analysis, the questioning that you have had in your own minds. And Jose, I appreciate the fact that you commented on your own sort of transformation from original thought into gradual thought. I believe this is the meaning of education, the meaning of why we are all affiliated with such a wonderful university as Georgetown University. And I just can't thank you enough for sharing your insight and your understanding and showing to all of us the great value and impact that Jesuits have had as diplomats and of course as religious leaders. So thank you so much for this evening's conversation, and thank you to all who were participating in the session tonight. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you all.